exactly who were the communists in the Philippine government. He was
He said, you no longer have anything that belongs to you.
Scholar at one of the Ivy League schools in the Northeast.
Welcome to the Speaker's Bureau. This program presents a conservative view of the world we live in. The information is presented by speakers from all walks of life. Now, let's meet today's guest speaker.
Any one of these accomplishments would be of interest. But our attention tonight is focused on the book he recently wrote, Global Tyranny, Step by Step. This book is a masterpiece of research that confirms what Bill had only suspected as an elementary school teacher. Simply stated that there is a plan. That plan calls for a socialistic global government. Mr. Jasper is here to tell us about that tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our speaker, William F. Jasper, and give him a big Dallas round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you for your warm Texas welcome. It is a pleasure, a delight to be back in Texas again. I always enjoy coming to Texas, and I especially appreciate you arranging the sunshine today and the break in the rainy weather which I've had around the country. It has not only been delightful, but it has helped lay to rest some scurrilous rumors that I am somehow, with my message of doom and gloom, bringing black clouds and torrential rains to the country everywhere I have traveled. And on the surface, there would seem to be some substance to the charges. Indeed, everywhere I have been on the East Coast, I started a couple of months ago, we did have some torrential rains and dark clouds all over the East Coast. And then I was on the West Coast, and again we saw the same thing. And then I went to the Midwest in the heartland here, and again we've had all these rains. But I assure you that that is not my doing, and in fact all of this past week everywhere I have been, it has been sunshining, and we have been having some break in the weather situation, and so I appreciate you continuing that here today. And in that regard, I would like to say I do have, and some people maybe will think as I launch into this 3-hour presentation tonight that all my message is doom and gloom. Let me assure you it is not. We have some very, very serious things to tell the American people about, a very serious alarm to sound. And in doing so, the first part of my presentation may sound like it's getting a little bit gloomy. There are some things we have to deal with, and there's no other way to do it. However, please be assured as we get toward the end of the program, I do have some sunshine, some very encouraging and hopeful solutions and victories to tell you about, and some positive things to mention to you. But before we go into there, I have to deal with another serious situation. Everywhere I go, someone comes up to me and says, "Mr. Jasper, you don't really look as mean in person as you do in your photograph." And they ask for some explanation for that. Really, I'm not a mean man. I'm kind of an amiable, jovial fellow. And it just seems, though, that the powers that be that put together the speaking tour said, "Bill, we can't put out a global tyranny tour with your usual smiling visage on there. That just wouldn't work. You need a little bit more of a stern image there." So when we had the photographer there, we were getting ready to shoot, the photographer said, "Say Hillary." And That was one of the more printable expressions that came out. So now you know. Well, America and the world today are at a crossroads. We're at a turning point in history, a very crucial turning point. And I contend that it is no less crucial than the turning point that will decide whether we shall remain a constitutional republic, whether we shall live under a constitution, the United States Constitution, our Bill of Rights, or whether we shall surrender our nation in a very near future to a world government, an all-powerful planetary global government under the United Nations, under United Nations treaty law. This is happening before us daily. We see it in the newspapers. Yet we see it in the headlines. We see it in the evening news. The United Nations is becoming empowered. Power is being transferred from nations to supernation state. We are reaching the point where the John Birch Society has warned about for 30 years. When the John Birch Society launched our campaign 30 years ago with big billboards and bumper stickers warning Americans to get us out to the United Nations and get the United Nations out of the United States, most Americans could not see the urgency. I could not see the urgency. I was, like most Americans, a strong supporter of the United Nations. After all, what was the story we were all taught? Once upon a time, at the end of World War II, the leaders of the world came together to put an end to war. They met in San Francisco and brought forth an organization that was going to bring about world peace, brotherhood, understanding, harmony, goodwill, and all of those things. Isn't that the story in the standard textbook rendering, the popular media? That is what most Americans believe. Today, a totally different picture is emerging. And I think there are some things I can share with you right off the bat that you can share with other Americans to help them see these dangers, to help them see through all of this massive barrage of storytelling and myth-making and outright propaganda that they have been bombarded with for so many years. Just a short time ago, April 15th, an annual celebration that all Americans are familiar with, known as Tax Day, occurred. You all remember April 15th. Is there anyone in here that feels they did not pay enough taxes last year? I've yet to find, I'm sure there's someone out there, but I've yet to find them. Because it's at this time of year when Americans are still feeling the sting of the tax man, and Americans are most painfully and acutely aware that the federal government is reaching ever deeper and deeper into our pockets, extracting more of our savings, more of our earnings, taking more of the fruits of our labor, whether we're a wage earner, whether we're self-employed, whether we're a businessman, and is taking that money and spending it on ever more foolish and dangerous and harmful programs. And Americans are well aware that the politicians in Washington are completely out of touch with reality. But if you think that the politicians in Washington are out of touch, and they are, do you think that international politicians and bureaucrats at the United Nations will be more sensitive, more responsible, more accountable, more responsive to the American taxpayer, to the American producer? Why do I ask? Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are fast approaching, in fact, in some ways have already reached the point where the United Nations is being empowered to tax American citizens. Is that news to you? Well, unfortunately, it's news to the vast majority of Americans. Probably not 1 in 1,000 realizes this, but yes, as I point out in my book, the United Nations is indeed moving forward to tax American citizens. Boutros Ghali, General Secretary of the United Nations, came forward with proposals last year, as did the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. A number of congressmen, legislators, and academics are already proposing this. That was part of proposals came out of the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro last year. Yes, we're seeing now proposals for the United Nations to be able to tax the people of the world, people of the United States, to tax our fuels, our carbon-based fuels, our gasoline, diesel, motor oil, heating oil, coal, all of the carbon-based fuels that are essential for modern industrialized society to provide us with electricity, to provide all of our clothing, our building materials, everything that is essential for a modern industrialized society. But it doesn't stop there. They want to tax our automobiles by weight and efficiency, to tax our international travel by air, train, boat, car, any conveyance. And beyond that, now proposals for a global value-added tax. And I can assure you, if these things go through, we will see proposals also for a global income tax. We are already experiencing some indirect taxation through the United Nations, some very major indirect taxation. And that has come through through another area of United Nations empowerment, that of global regulation, primarily through regulation of the environment. I was down at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro covering it for the New American Magazine last year. Many of you who subscribe to the New American Magazine would be familiar with this issue. This is our Resilient Earth issue that we brought out right before the Earth Summit. And I'm the senior editor of the New American, and then I was down covering the Earth Summit for our magazine. A number of incredible proposals came out of that meeting. Let me assure you, that was not a pleasant experience down in Rio. Myself and a few other sane individuals, maybe a half dozen, amid some 35,000 greenies, globies, and warmies from all areas of the earth, all intent upon establishing a global socialist manifesto for the world, and particularly targeting the United States as the global eco-villain. One of those proposals which came out of the Earth Summit, the Global Warming Treaty, has already been pushed through in the United States. Another one, it has been put on the fast track in the U.S. Senate by our new President Clinton, the Biodiversity Treaty. Now, anyone who is familiar with the already strangulating regulations that our federal government is imposing on our economy and all aspects of it, and recognize the way that it is already damaging our whole economic system, our system of private property rights and whatnot. In fact, if you're not aware of that, this latest issue of the New American Magazine, this is our special regulatory issue, Regulation in America. Is this still the land of the free? We've surveyed all of the federal programs and agencies and regulations that are destroying America, our competitiveness, our economic progress. If you're familiar with the way in which those federal regulations and state and local regulations are creating all of this havoc, then you can appreciate perhaps the kind of danger we are entering into when we get into global regulation, when we have global regulators from a global EPA out of the United Nations, regulators from Asia and Africa and Europe deciding policies for the United States, for the American employer, for the American businessman, for the American employee. That is what the Biodiversity Treaty is taking us toward. If you haven't already contacted your senators about it, you need to. You need to first read about it in the New American and then find out how that is going to affect you, because I assure you it will, in very dramatic ways. As I flew into the Midwest a couple of weeks ago on this part of the tour, I soon recognized that by federal definitions, virtually the entire Midwest, and actually now most of the country, since my rainfall excursion, is now designated as a federal wetlands. We have been writing about the disasters that federal wetlands designations have brought to thousands of Americans. In the New American magazine, we've been covering that issue quite extensively. If you're not familiar with it, let me assure you, if your backyard or your ranch or your farm or your place of business, property that you own, real estate, is designated as a federal wetland, you can do almost nothing on it. You cannot turn over a spade of dirt. You cannot put in a fence post. You cannot take out a fence post. You cannot build anything on it unless you get permission from the EPA, from the Corps of Engineers. And if you do any of those things in violation of the federal permits, you can end up in jail, in federal penitentiary, as a number of Americans already have. Now, if we see this kind of tyrannical result coming from federal regulations, do we really think that international regulation by unelected international bureaucrats are going to bring us greater protections, greater benefits to our lives? I don't think anyone who reflects on that for even a moment will believe that they are going to acquire any great benefit from this kind of international regulation. Yet, we are dangerously close to seeing that imposed, not only wetlands, but endangered species legislation. I come from the Pacific Northwest, where the spotted owl has displaced, or rather, federal regulations claiming to protect the spotted owl have displaced human species. Whole communities have been destroyed, shut down as a result of that, and all throughout the rest of the country, housing prices have risen thousands of dollars per house for building a new house as a result of that federal regulation. I don't really think many Americans, if they recognize the dangers inherent in the Biodiversity Treaty, will relish the idea of global bureaucrats having this new kind of power over American lives. Well, let's look at an area where we are already feeling United Nations global environmental regulation. As I stand right here under the hot lights, the air conditioning is quite pleasant, and I'm thankful that it is still available to us, and down here in this part of the country, it is really essential. In fact, in most parts of the world, air conditioning and refrigeration are essential for modern society. Yet, all of that is threatened. Not only our comfort, but our availability of food, because all of our storage and transportation and food distribution networks require refrigeration. All of that is threatened by a United Nations treaty, which our Senate has already passed. It's called the Montreal Protocol on Ozone Depletion. You've heard the story many times. According to a few fraudulent studies and a few alleged scientists, CFCs and Freon out of our air conditioners, out of our refrigerators, are drifting up into the upper stratosphere and destroying the ozone and creating ozone holes and ozone depletion, and ultraviolet rays from the sun are going to come down and fry all of the people on Earth and give us cancer, and all of these terrible things cause famines, and all these terrible apocalyptic scenarios of doom, ecological destruction. If you believe that, and the global warming and all of those other fright-peddling chicken little stories that have been barraging America for the last several years, you really owe it to yourself to get a copy of this issue of the New American Magazine. This particular issue, we have provided you with actually a handbook of scientific facts. We've interviewed some of the leading scientists in the world on all of these different issues. We've surveyed all of the scientific literature on it, and we've condensed it all down and presented it in a way in which you can convince yourselves, if you need convincing, or your friends and relatives, who certainly do, certainly a great many of them do need convincing, that we do not have to run around in hysterical fright from all of these supposed threats to our world ecology, and we do not have to ask the federal government and now world government to take over more and more areas of our lives to protect us from these alleged threats. Because the good news is, ladies and gentlemen, none of these alleged threats, whether it's acid rain, global warming, ozone depletion, PCBs, ALAR, asbestos, radon, or whatever, none of these are genuine threats to America. Some of them are problems, yes. None of them are threats to the world. None of them are threats to global mankind. And none of them can justify all of the vast new pressure to establish global tyranny to deal with them. We are told we must establish a global environmental police state to save us from ourselves. The bad news is many people have been frightened by all this repetition again and again of all these bogus studies that they are willing to accept it. And it is coming at us through various United Nations treaties, treaty law. The United Nations Protocol on Ozone Depletion may cost the world economy $5 trillion to dispose of, replace hundreds of millions of perfectly good refrigerators, air conditioners, as well as mandating all kinds of wasteful regulations and putting new restrictions on mechanics and people who work with these things, requiring them to spend thousands of dollars on needless equipment, training, and things of that nature. So you are going to find, if you haven't already, that when you go to have your air conditioner or refrigerator reconditioned, what used to just require a serviceman coming out, or you could do it yourself, putting some Freon in your refrigerator or your air conditioner, instead of it now costing you $10 for the Freon or $20 or $30 for the serviceman to do it, you're going to find out that it costs you $100, $200, $300, $400, $500. I just found out in my case it was $600 for my car air conditioner. Completely needless. $5 trillion worldwide. That's $5 trillion that could go to providing food, clothing, shelter, education, health care, new capital for new jobs, new industries that will be totally wasted, destroyed. This is such a huge destruction of economic resources unequaled in world history by any government fiat, any mandate. That's the equivalent of, it's greater than the economic resources destroyed in our world wars, and all done by legislative fiat. The Global Warming Treaty is already in the works. I was watching on C-SPAN a couple of days ago. Former Senator Tim Wirth, who has been, of Colorado, who's been appointed by President Clinton as his counsel to the State Department, was testifying before a House committee, telling us now that we passed the Global Warming Treaty, we have to put into effect the teeth that go into the treaty, the regulations that will carry out the treaty's objectives. And so now we're talking about restricting use of fossil fuels, taxing all these fossil fuels, taxing automobiles, making more of this personal freedom in transportation inaccessible to American citizens. Close to home here for many of you folks, and actually it will be affecting the entire nation, is the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. How does that relate to the United Nations? Ladies and gentlemen, in my book, Global Tyranny, I go into the history of the European common market, the European community. The North American Free Trade Agreement has striking parallels, is very closely related to what we saw in 1958 with the Treaty of Rome, with the creation of the European community. In fact, in today's copy of USA Today, publisher Al Newhart has a editorial calling for passage of the North American Free Trade Agreement, and he is citing the similarities between the situation, the European community and the North American Free Trade Agreement. It is coming out much more into the open now that this has nothing to do with a free trade agreement. It has to do with creating a common market. What began as a common market in Europe has now become an actual amalgamation of those countries into a superstate run out of Brussels, a socialist superstate. That is what we are now facing here in the United States, besides most of the opposition to the North American Free Trade Agreement, has been concentration on the economic impact that it will have on jobs, on our economy, and that's definitely a very big concern. But ultimately what the objective is to destroy national sovereignty, to intertwine us with the countries of North America, destroy our borders, our national sovereignty, so that we will begin to be governed by treaty law rather than our national constitution, and eventually we will become one big regional government here in North America, as is happening now in Europe, where the countries of Europe, France, Germany, England, whatnot, are being run out of Brussels. Their national legislatures are becoming increasingly irrelevant. Their representatives that they vote for to send to the House of Lords and the House of Commons and to Parliament and whatnot are really irrelevant. Their laws, their governance is coming out of Brussels, out of the European community. We will see that same thing established here if we allow this treaty to go through. If you have not already contacted your senators about the North American Free Trade Agreement, about the Biodiversity Treaty, about the Global Warming Treaty, it's about time to do so. In fact, tonight, after midnight, when we get out of here, contact your senators, your congressmen. Tomorrow at the latest, write them, call them, fax them, and demand to know their position on these things. Let them know of your opposition to them. And then don't stop with that. Keep going until you get satisfaction. Again and again and again. Besiege them. You can be sure the other side is already doing that. And the kind of people that we have in Congress are not noted for their courage in standing up to pressure and to lobbies. And if you're not applying at least equal pressure to what is being applied from the other side, we know which way they will go. Well, those areas that I've already mentioned should be areas enough for to get Americans outraged, to get Americans to get them deadly concerned about what is happening. But here's another one which is especially important, which is going to strike directly into our homes. And probably not 1 in 1,000 Americans is aware of it or has seen this document. This is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Well, everyone loves children. You love children. I love children. I have children. Why would anyone be against a convention on the rights of the child? We are told by its proponents that it is to protect children. And obviously everyone wants to protect children, protect their rights. I contend that anyone who is a parent or a grandparent or hopes to be a parent or grandparent had better take a very hard, long, sober look at this and examine it. And I have done so in one of the chapters in my book titled The UN Grab for Your Child. Now, this is a very complex, involved document involving 54 articles covering everything from adoption to abortion to prenatal and postnatal, maternal care, daycare, child medical care, education, all aspects of parental-child relationships. This will completely, if passed, if ratified by the United States Senate, could completely rearrange, completely destroy the American constitutional system of government, particularly as it relates to the family and the interrelationship of family law at the state, local, and federal level. Let me just read you one example, Article 13, out of this convention. The child shall have the right to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, either orally, in writing, or in print, in the form of art or through any other media of the child's choice. Well, at first look, the average person sees that. That doesn't look so dangerous or harmful. Yet anyone who is even remotely familiar with the devastating impact that a single misplaced comma can have in a legal document, in a piece of legislation, can easily recognize that this broadly worded, sweeping statement, one sentence, represents an enormous chasm through which whole armies of American Civil Liberties Union attorneys and other self-appointed advocates of child's rights could march in lockstep to completely undermine and devastate our entire social structure, our entire constitutional system. Consider for a moment. You think this is a little bit incredulous to suggest a scenario of this type in our current litigious society and the current structure of things where we see all kinds of militant advocacy groups at work? Consider for a second. Little Johnny or Susie comes home from school. They have some literature which has been passed out in class by a local AIDS Foundation or Gay and Lesbian Task Force, which have visited their school, have been invited in to speak to the kids. And they come home with this literature, or perhaps some condoms and other things with it as well. And mom and dad are shocked and outraged. And they demand to know from Johnny and Susie how they got these things, and they take them away. And Johnny or Susie says, well, Mom, Dad, you can't take that away. I have a right to this. I have a right to receive information and ideas of all kinds, either orally in writing or in print, in the form of art or through any other media of the child's choice. Do you think it is too far out or exaggerating concern to think that something like that might happen, and that even a local attorney, ACLU attorney, or other self-appointed child's advocate might take their case even to court to challenge your right as a parent to protect them, or in this case they would say censor what your child may receive? Anyone familiar with what is already happening in our courts recognize that this is not far out at all. This could be expected, should be expected, if we give legal standing to this through a United Nations treaty ratified by our United States Senate. Consider a whole host of possibilities. If a child decides, a child is defined in here as anyone from birth to age 18. If your child decides he wants to wear satanic symbols or obscene t-shirts or decorate his room with similar things, and you, showing justified parental concern, try to curtail that, or you want to send him to a Christian school or a private school where he can't be with other influences which you find objectionable. Could you imagine there might be somewhere in the country some students that would find that a violation of their rights and would sue their parents? Well, it is already happening. As you may have already noted if you watch any television, there are a couple of movies coming out now to actually promote and glorify the youngster who did sue his parents successfully and divorced himself from his parents, and those movies are going to be coming out very soon on I think on the Fox network and a couple of and one of the other networks. United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. If you haven't already read our treatment of it in the New American Magazine or in the book Global Tyranny, you need to get that, read it. You need to be contacting your senators. Fortunately, we're not alone on this. Many other people have gotten into this, and we have quite a number of other educational and religious and church groups that have joined in the battle and focused on the family, and Concerned Women of America and Eagle Forum, and quite a few churches are now opposing this. And if we get your voices joined to it, and all of your organizations and patriotic and educational organizations that you're affiliated with joining this, we will see the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child go down to defeat. If we muster the opposition in time and before the senators already become committed to it, because you see, First Person Hillary is a big advocate of this, a champion of this children's rights movement. She was head of the Children's Defense Fund, As a lawyer, she wrote very strongly in favor of children's rights to sue their parents, to divorce themselves from their parents. And so she is going to use all of the power that she can muster in the White House to push this through. And we need to get the opposition going right now. Well, ladies and gentlemen, all of these areas that I've discussed so far, whether it's the taxing, the regulation, or the new threats of United Nations intervention into our family lives, where United Nations agencies could begin dictating family policy through this treaty, all of these are coming together in an effort to replace the United States Constitution with the United Nations Charter. This is happening right now before our eyes. We already see it with regard to the first steps that have been taken under the Global Warming Treaty, under the Ozone Treaty. All of this has to do with empowerment. This is a key word. You'll be seeing it over and over again. In fact, it has already been used quite a few times now that I've pointed it out to you. If you hadn't noticed it before, I'm sure you will. Look for this word, empowering the United Nations, empowerment for the United Nations. It's all about a transfer of power from the people, from the states, from the national governments to a world government. And that is the bottom line on all of this. You see, we were told that the United Nations was all about bringing people together to talk things out and bring about understanding and world peace. Ladies and gentlemen, that was not only a myth, it was a lie, a monstrous lie. From the very beginning, and in the early chapters of my book, I go through the whole development of the League of Nations back at the end of World War I, and the people and the organizations who drew up the charter for the League of Nations. And then, when that failed, how they began to organize and propagandize for another attempt, a United Nations. And all during the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, up until the end of World War II, all of the organizations and individuals who were most involved in the forefront of this whole movement to create a United Nations. And I go through their documents and through their speeches and through their memoranda to each other. And it is quite clear, it is unmistakably clear, that from the very beginning the United Nations was never intended by its founders, by its designers, to be a forum for world peace. It was designed as a plan to create a global world government that would submerge all nations within its all-powerful purview. When I began to find these things out, I was mad. I was so mad that I burned all my UNICEF Christmas cards. Yeah, that's the truth. I really did. I had been doing my piece for world peace, my bit for world peace, brotherhood, and understanding. Thank you. And for the children of the world by sending out UNICEF Christmas cards. And I'm sure many other well-meaning individuals across the country have done likewise. The supreme irony in this, and I go into it in more detail in one of the chapters of the book on the new world, new age religion that the United Nations is promoting, is that UNICEF